What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Pick Six Podcast, CBS Sports NFL Podcast. I'm Will Brinson. I'm your host, joined on an emergency podcast by a man who looks just like me, a little bit like Bill Belichick today, John Breech, to talk about Ron Rivera being fired in Washington. No huge surprise here, Breech. We talked about Arthur Smith in the recap podcast last night, but we're going to break down Commanders moving on from Ron Rivera officially. Would have happened yesterday, didn't because it was his birthday. So happy belated birthday, Ron. You're fired.
Hey, you know what? At least they showed a little bit of restraint. Dan Snyder would have sent him a birthday cake that said, "You're fired." So maybe it's for the best that Josh Harris is in there right now. But yeah, you milk it out a day, do it on Black Monday when everybody else gets fired. And they didn't do it at midnight like the Falcons did to Arthur Smith. But Brinson, I think we both know.
By the way, I'm reliably told that had nothing to do with the post-game melee with the Falcons. And it was simply just a function of Arthur Blank and the Falcons management had their meeting. The meeting ended around midnight, and they're like, yeah, but this is the direction we're going.
Oh, with the Smith thing, that just felt like him blowing his top because he knew his job was right. He knew he was getting fired. He was down 48-17. I think Arthur Blank made his decision long before that. But it feels like with the Commanders, remember, this team started the season 2-0, and it was like, oh my God, what if Ron Rivera turns this team around and they become successful in Josh Harris's first season as owner? And then, as we know, the season totally collapsed after that. I think by the bye week, which was in December, they had the latest bye week. They were 4-9, and it was pretty clear that Rivera was a dead man walking. He was going to get fired, and that was that. So I think this was probably the Arthur Smith thing felt like 70-30. He was probably going to lose his job. This felt like 99% he was going to lose his job, and we've all known this since December. So I would say this is the least surprising firing that will happen in this coaching cycle.
Yeah, I mean, this is if there was ever there's ever a head coaching firing that you're like, okay, do we need an emergency podcast for it? I mean, this would be it, because the last time that the Commanders won was November 5th, and the time before that was October 15th, and the time before that was September 17th. So they have 2 wins since September 17th, since week 2. They've lost to everybody. They beat the Falcons. They beat the Patriots. They lost in horrendous fashion. They got blown out. Sam Howell got sacked a ton of times. Ron Rivera saying stuff like, the first time I've coached in 3.5 years. I've been busy managing. And I think some of that is there's a little bit of that's true. When Ron Rivera was brought in to Washington, he was in charge of sort of changing the culture. You know, this is Dan Snyder knowing he was on his last legs as owner, trying to fix things and salvage things to keep the NFL from forcing a sale. They wanted Ron Rivera. Ron Rivera was, is an established culture guy who also happens to provide some diversity for a team that didn't have any at the time whatsoever. They made a dedicated attempt to do that when they were revamping things. Rivera, I think, did a good job changing the culture as best he could in Washington. I think he helped to shepherd and it's weird too, because he's now done this two different times in his last 2 jobs, been the guy who previous owner forced to sell amongst scandalous timeline. Ron rides it out and then, is let go by the new owner. And that's sort of the crux of this to me, for me, Breech. It's not like Ron Rivera did a terrible job. Ron Rivera took over a really hard situation, didn't win many football games, but won maybe more, at least early on, than I think, another coach might have. Washington hadn't been good for a long time. And also, what do you want to do? You want a division title in 2020, right? Yep. Also, we went to the playoffs. It's like whoever the coach was that Dan Snyder hired last was going to get fired, because that's what happens when you spend $6 billion on a team. You are allowed to hire your own coach. I think David Tepper's doing a terrible job of it in Carolina, but it's his team and he can do what he wants. And I do applaud Josh Harris in this instance for showing the patience to. I mean, a lot of guys would have fired Ron Rivera in the Week 14 bye, after on a 4-game losing streak when your team is 4 and 4-9. You ride it out. You let him do the whole season. You do things differently than Dan Snyder did. And I think we've seen that from ownership so far in Washington under this new regime.
Yeah, I think one crazy thing about Ron Rivera is that when he got hired in January 2020, he got hired by the Washington Redskins. That following July is when they changed their name to the football team and then changed their name to the Commanders. So a guy literally coaching kind of for 3 different teams. But the thing is, when Dan Snyder hired,
he has the best winning percentage in WFT and Commanders history
so far. Yeah, man, he's going to be at the top of his name's going to be in the practice
all-time winningest record. Is he the all-time? Is he the only
football
NFL
team coach? WFT.
No, but I'm saying he's the all-time winningest coach for like multiple franchise, like three different team names: the Panthers, maybe John Fox is more. Anyway, continue on.
But what I was going to say is that, look, you knew walking into this situation. I do feel a little bit of empathy for him because of the crappy situation he was in with Dan Snyder. There were their investigations. Snyder got fined $10 million during, or more than that. I mean, it was an ugly situation. But when you take a job with Dan Snyder, you know that's what you're walking into. So it's hard to feel sorry for someone who said, you know what, I'm going to deal with it. I think I can fix this. And I also think that it hurt Rivera that he made the playoffs in his first year as coach, which was completely out of nowhere. No one was expecting that. He wins the NFC East because at that point it was like, oh my God, this guy can deal with the drama. He can fix this team. And then they just never were able to get anywhere near that. And yes, they did go 8-1 last season in 2022, but the Cowboys and Eagles were so good that didn't mean anything. And, I think if Ron Rivera had gone 9-8 this year, or maybe even 8-9, somewhere close to 500. He probably doesn't get fired, but you can't go 4-13 as you just mentioned. 2-13 over the final 15 games. Ended the season on an 8-game losing streak. And again, like you said, Josh Harris spent $6 billion, and we mentioned that Rick Spielman, our guy Rick Spielman, Wilson's guy. Wilson wouldn't show up. He's probably talking with Rick right now about who the Commanders should hire.
Or Wilson's crying in a pool of sadness.
But Rick Spielman will be helping out with the hiring process. He'll be advising Josh Harris along with Bob Myers, the former Warriors general manager. Is he Warriors general manager?
Yeah, Warriors GM. Yeah. Four-time NBA champion. I'm curious.
And that's what you do if you have $6 billion, though. You call these guys with the expertise. And you say, hey, help me get a good coach in here. That's what I want.
What do you think about that combo? And it doesn't sound like, and I don't want to, not suggesting that we know otherwise. We may, but like it's been reported, so I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here. But Rick Spielman and Bob Myers are not like serving as GM or general managers or full-time employees of the Washington football team. 2-time NBA Executive of the Year, Bob Myers, 4-time NBA champ. Also gets to keep working on the ESPN. NBA on ESPN.
Hey, and Brenton, Rick gets to keep working for us, so it's.
I know. I think Rick's going to keep working for us, which is a very interesting dynamic. So if Wilson doesn't get some Commander scoops, this is just pathetic. He and Rick drive around in a minivan all off season together, going to pro days. I think it's a really interesting move here. You were saying, okay, Bob Myers, great culture guy, was able to put together this thing with the Warriors. And granted, it helps that you get Steph Curry in the draft where you get him, he falls. But, you're able to you find Draymond Green, you find Klay Thompson, you put this all together with Steve Kerr, who, by the way, when he hired Steve Kerr to be the Warriors head coach, Steve Kerr had 0 coaching experience. And Steve Kerr immediately was incredible and won a ton of basketball games, excuse me. And then you have, you bring in Kevin Durant. There's just the Warriors. The people don't like the Warriors anymore, but the Warriors were the ultimate. The Warriors were a little bit like the Patriots in that they had this dynastic sort of out of nowhere come together culture. It's a big culture thing. And so I think having Bob Myers come in and try and identify candidates who can help the culture, identify ways to improve the culture. And then you also have Rick Spielman as this sort of a checks and balances type of thing with the football mentality and what he was able to do as an actual NFL GM. And I think he did a good job in Minnesota. But I think that combination is really interesting and does speak to Breech a really like drastic or not power shift, but a really drastic sort of shift in how NFL teams are constructing front offices versus even 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago.
Well, I think the big thing here is when you're someone like Josh Harris, where you don't know what you don't know, you want to bring in experts. And I'm sure Harris thought, you have some teams that will bring in the search firm who are not NFL people who come in and crunch the numbers and say, oh, you should hire this guy. And Harris thought, why would I hire a search firm when I can basically Spielman and Myers are his search firm? I've got this guy who has an amassed wealth of football knowledge in Spielman. I have this guy who's won multiple championships in his sport and can think outside the box. Combine those two together, and that should help me to get to where I want to go. So it does make sense that this is not a full-time thing, that they're basically serving as his search firm. And I think if this works, we'll see other teams do it because the NFL is a copycat league. If Spielman and Myers tell him to say trade for Belichick and Belichick wins 2 Super Bowls, then you're going to see the Spielman and Myers combo. They're going to be going to every team saying, hey, we'll pick your coach out for you.
Well, and a lot of times these search firms or like I think getting Rick and getting Bob Myers, again, Rick has a lot of experience in the NFL, knows a lot of people around the NFL. But then using Bob Myers, again, as a check and balance sort of thing, to me, that makes a lot of sense versus where it's like, I feel like every other search firm is like, it's like Ernie Accorsi is telling you who to hire, right? And Ernie Accorsi is saying like, hire some guy that worked with him in the Giants. I also think you're going to see the Washington hire some like, and this may, I don't think Rick wants to get back in, but it wouldn't shock me if he took this job. Although I don't know if he loved doing it when he was at the end of his run, but like VP of football operations, I think you're going to see Washington build out a hierarchy like that, where they find it's going to depend on who they get for the coach, right? Because like if you, this is what makes this particular coaching. Actually, you know what? Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about why the candidates may change the way that Washington structures its front office next.
Well, you need your sports news anywhere?
We've got breaking news to bring you.
Then get your sports anytime you want them. Big trade news overnight to discuss.
Because we know you need sports all the time.
A lot of movement in the rankings this week.
A legend adds to their legacy.
We're bringing you that breaking news right here on HQ.
CBS Sports HQ, anywhere, anytime, all the time.
So, again, I think what's interesting about this particular cycle is that Bill Belichick is out there. And Jim Harbaugh is out there. And Harbaugh's been out there for a while, but this feels like for the first time, Harbaugh, and he interviewed last year with Minnesota, or 2 years ago with Minnesota, or whatever it was. It does feel like Harbaugh is coming back, and he plays in the national championship game on Monday night, and we'll know more about his future soon. And Belichick, it feels like there's a good chance he moves on. If you are attempting to lure Jim Harbaugh or Bill Belichick, you have to be really careful and fluid about your hiring process for the GM and your front office and all of that, right? If Josh Harris wants to get Bill Belichick to Washington, and reports are that he is enamored with the idea, he can't go out and hire a GM. If you go out and hire a GM and you're like, hey, Bill, you're working with this guy, Bill is going to be like, no dice, dude. Bill is going to want to put people around. If he goes somewhere new, he's certainly going to want, I would think, personnel control. We'll talk more about his comments in our recap show at 5:00 today about what he said about possibly not wanting personnel control in New England. But the point being, I think you'll see teams in this particular cycle. Look at the Falcons. Like Terry Fontenot is still there. If they want to get Harbaugh or Belichick, you have to imagine that it's like he'll have input in it. He's not hiring the guy. Martin Mayhew still there in Washington, which is kind of surprising. I thought they would let him go. He is certainly somebody who could be let go if the right coaching candidate comes around, don't you think?
Well, I think that with the Commanders, it'll be interesting to see if Josh Harris just says, I want to make a big splash, which would be trading for Belichick or going after Jim Harbaugh, because you've got all this money and you're going to be in your first real full calendar year of owning the team. And is this the guy you want to bring in? And like you just said, that's important because you cannot hire your general manager first. And I thought it was crazy that the Falcons kind of threw Terry Fontenot under the bus by in the statement saying he's not helping with this coaching. So he'll have a little bit of input.
He'll have input, yeah.
But me and Rich McKay are handling this. Arthur Blank and Rich McKay are handling this.
Rich McKay is the biggest Teflon dude on the planet, man. It's amazing. He's like the only time you ever hear Rich McKay mentioned with the Falcons is when they're hiring a new coach. It's like never like Rich. He never catches any grief. And Rich does a lot of work with the NFL competition committee as well. But you never hear Rich McKay catch any grief when the Falcons stink. It's only when they're like hiring somebody. It's like Rich McKay will be making these decisions.
But yeah, so I think this will come down to, I'm sure Bob Myers, Rick Spielman will talk with Josh Harris about the ins and outs of, hey, you bring in a guy like Belichick, this is what your front office structure is going to look like. Bring in a guy like Harbaugh, this is what's going to happen. Or you can bring in someone who's not as heavy-handed as those two, and they won't have all the. Do you want to give all the control to the head coach? Is what it will come down to.
Right, exactly. I know Dom in the chat pointed out that Ben Johnson could be the guy. There is definitely a connection with Rick Spielman and the Lions. I mean, Chris Spielman is president of football operations or something. Rick's brother Chris is heavily involved in the front office in Detroit. And that, I mean, I'm not saying that that's going to sway anything and that Ben Johnson's going to be like, oh, cool, I'll go to Washington because your brother's working there. But in the business world and in the football, just as is in the business world, the football world operates on connections. And if there is a case, like if Washington wants to go after Ben Johnson, you have a direct conduit from Rick to Chris to Ben Johnson. Like, you know what I mean? I mean, I don't think it's like crazy to suggest that.
Yeah. I mean, I would think that is an open pipeline and you're going to take advantage of it. And you see where that takes you, and then you look at the other candidates. Because I think if you're looking at someone like Ben Johnson, that you're thinking, let's bring in an offensive-minded guy. But the other part is you don't even know who your quarterback's going to be. You don't know for sure if Sam Howell's still going to be there.
Maybe they should hire Mac Brown, and he can coach Drake May and Sam Howell.
But you have the number 2 overall pick, so you can look at drafting quarterbacks. But that's another thing to consider with giving a guy full power or how you're going to do this is that your future hinges a lot on this draft, and you don't want someone to come in and whiff in their first draft because that would be a total disaster. So, but definitely Ben Johnson, I would think, would be someone they would talk to.
Yeah, for sure. It would seem like, I mean, I'm joking about the Mac Brown, Drake May stuff, but I mean, there's a pretty good chance that Drake May, Caleb Williams, right now, and look, it's January. A lot can change. But let's assume Caleb Williams goes 1 to some team that trades up with the Bears. And the Commanders.
Real quick, Brinson, to interrupt you, we started talking about the Ben Johnson stuff at 10:31. At 10:33 Eastern time, Tom Pelissero tweets out or X's out, the Commanders aren't wasting time. They've requested interviews with Lions OC Ben Johnson and Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn for their head coaching job. So there you go. There is the Lions connection. The pipeline's already paying off. You got 2 interviews set up.
I mean, if you think about it, though, like it's not insane you're Josh Harris. You paid $6 billion for the franchise. You want to get the easiest possible way to get a sit down with Ben Johnson and have him like you go and pay Rick Spielman whatever his fee is to consult on this gig. And he's like, hey, Chris, tell Ben that this is a good look. Like I've worked. Yeah, I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like it's a very smart and savvy business move, I think. And that outside the box stuff that they're doing with the Bob Myers thing, I think that probably resonates with Ben Johnson as well. So smart to talk to the Lions coaches. And I'm sure we will see. Yes, that's right. How did you get that tweet before I did? I just got it.
Because I get everything before you, Brinson.
Are you on premium? Any other candidates?
Check mark next to my name.
Do you?
No.
Oh. Any other candidates that stand out to you as
Well, I think one interesting one who I'm not sure they would hire because he's there right now is Eric Bieniemy, where he's already on your staff as an offense coordinator. I wonder how much the team liked him and if that's someone they would consider.
Keep him around. Let Sam Howell get sacked some more. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's not the sacks aren't Bieniemy's fault. Like his offense isn't going to work if the QB is getting sacked on every play. So I think it's kind of, but also, Bieniemy could call different plays so that their QB is not getting sacked as often. So it's kind of a push and shove there. Maybe your boy Bobby Slowick in Houston, I think would be a very interesting name. If Josh Harris wants to look right down the road in Baltimore, Mike McDonald. If you want to go with a defensive coordinator. And then, of course, my favorite guy to bring up every time is Miami of Ohio hero, Frank Smith, who is now the offensive coordinator with the Dolphins. That'd be another interesting name to call. And I think the other thing you have to figure out is, do you want to go with a defensive guy, an offensive guy, or just, the guy who not an offensive guy, or the CEO type. So I think that's the thing you figured out first before you make the hire.
I think a lot will depend too on look, when you talk to these candidates, you sort of have to say, what do you think? I mean, it's so weird because you kind of need to say, what do you think about this draft class? Do you have you watched any Caleb Williams? And these candidates probably may not have, they may have seen it, but not watched a bunch of film. So I think, I'm almost certainly going offense. I would have not be opposed to CEO at all, but I would want to go offensive mind if I have the number 2 overall pick and I plan on drafting a quarterback, primarily, Breech, because if you go defensive or CEO, let's say just take the Texans as an example. It's actually a great example because they drafted 2nd overall and took CJ Stroud. They hired DeMeco Ryans. They draft CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud has this incredible year, but now his offensive coordinator could leave for a head coaching job. And so you could lose the continuity of that quarterback development by virtue of going with a defensive guy or a CEO guy, simply by virtue of your own success. Bryce Young is not losing continuity because he was right. Because CJ Stroud was so good, Bobby Slowick is getting looks as a head coach, or is going to get looks as a head coach. And so that's why I would probably lean offensive guy.
And one thing I'll throw out, just because we mentioned the Lions interviews and because of what happened last year with Jonathan Gannon and the Eagles, and that feels like it's a feud that there's still some hurt feelings there with the Eagles thinking he may have focused too much on his Cardinals interview than putting together his defensive game plan for the Super Bowl, is that the Lions, if Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn decide to interview with the Commanders, they cannot do it until the Tuesday after their wild card game. So that would be January 16th. That'd be the earliest, and it would be a virtual interview.
Big fan too of the interview and meet the Lions lay a complete egg on offense against the Rams, and then
or the Rams put up 40.
Right. Remember when the Lions hired Matt Patricia, they interviewed him right after the Super Bowl where he gave up 55 points to Nick Foles. It's
right.
Yeah. Or the Jonathan Gannon thing. All right. So that'll do it for us. Ron Rivera fired in Washington. Riverboat Ron. Oh, but one more thing. Do you think Riverboat Ron gets a 3rd try as a head coach?
If he does, I don't think it will be in 2024. So I think he's going to be out this year. And unless you're in a spot where he's got that comforting, I understand why teams bring him in. He's a steadying hand. And if there is a team in that situation, I could see him getting one, but I would say I'd lean no. I'd say 60-40 no.
Fun fact. One of the few, of the recent guys who've gotten 3 tries, John Fox, Lovie Smith, both of them coached in the NFC South. I could see Ron Rivera getting another look at some
going to Tampa Bay.
Year. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Going somewhere. All right. That'll do it for us. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. For Breech, I'm Brinson. We'll see you guys later.